Sarah Mitchell had always been someone who blended into the background of life's grand stage. At 28 years old, she worked as a medical records clerk at a bustling city hospital, earning just enough to cover rent on her modest studio apartment and the occasional treat of takeout on Friday nights. Her mornings began with the screech of an alarm at 6:30, followed by a rushed commute on packed subway cars, and her evenings concluded with microwave dinners eaten in front of a laptop streaming her favorite shows. Life wasn't terrible, but it wasn't extraordinary either. Sarah had dreams, of course, dreams of traveling to places she'd only seen in Instagram posts, of opening her own business, of living somewhere with more than one window. But these aspirations felt distant, like stars she could admire but never touch. Her adoptive parents, modest and loving people who had passed away 5 years earlier, had given her everything they could. They'd taught her resilience, kindness, and the value of hard work. Yet despite their unconditional love, Sarah had always sensed something indefinable was missing. A phantom limb she couldn't quite name. Sometimes late at night, she'd catch herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, searching for clues about where she came from. Her olive skin and dark, almost black eyes didn't resemble her adoptive parents' fair complexions. Who did she look like? Where had her high cheekbones come from? These questions hummed quietly in the background of her consciousness, never loud enough to demand action, but persistent enough to create a hollow ache. One particularly difficult month, when her car broke down and an unexpected medical bill arrived simultaneously, Sarah found herself sitting on her apartment floor, surrounded by overdue notices. She counted the remaining $47 in her checking account and laughed, not from humor, but from the absurdity of it all. This was her reality, constantly one emergency away from financial catastrophe, despite working full-time and living as frugally as possible. She had no idea that in just 3 weeks, this struggle would feel like a distant memory from someone else's life. The catalyst arrived in the form of a white envelope on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Sarah had submitted her DNA to one of those ancestry testing services 6 months earlier during a holiday sale, more out of curiosity than any real expectation. She'd imagined discovering some distant cousins or learning about her ethnic background, nothing earth-shattering. Instead, the email notification simply read, "New close family match detected." Sarah's hands trembled as she logged into the account from her phone during her lunch break. The match wasn't distant at all. According to the analysis, she had a biological sibling, a brother. Within hours, she'd received a message through the platform from someone named Marcus Whitmore, claiming to be that brother and requesting a phone call. The conversation that followed shattered every assumption Sarah had built about her origins. Marcus's voice was smooth, educated, tinged with an accent that suggested expensive boarding schools. He explained that he'd been searching for her for 2 years after discovering papers in their late mother's estate. Their mother, Victoria Whitmore, had given Sarah up for adoption under complicated circumstances when she was just days old, before marrying into the prominent Whitmore family. A name Sarah vaguely recognized from business magazines and society pages. "You're a Whitmore," Marcus had said, his words hanging in the air like suspended disbelief. "Our family has been incomplete without you," Sarah's mind reeled. The Whitmores weren't just wealthy, they were billionaire dynasty wealthy. They owned pharmaceutical companies, real estate empires, and had a foundation that donated millions annually. And somehow, impossibly, she was one of them. The following week passed in a surreal blur. A private investigator confirmed the connection through additional documentation. Legal papers were drawn up, and then came the invitation. Marcus wanted her to fly to the family estate, her family estate, to meet everyone in person. First-class tickets appeared in her email inbox. Sarah sat in her cramped apartment, staring at the boarding pass on her screen, feeling as though she'd slipped into an alternate dimension where the laws of her reality no longer applied. The Whitmore estate sprawled across 200 acres of manicured grounds in upstate New York, a world away from Sarah's studio apartment with its persistent radiator clank. As the car, a pristine black Mercedes that had picked her up from the private airfield, wound up the tree-lined driveway, Sarah pressed her face to the window like a child, trying to comprehend the scale of what she was seeing. The mansion itself looked like something transplanted from a European countryside, all stone facades and towering windows that caught the afternoon sun. Marcus greeted her at the front entrance, his embrace warm and seemingly genuine. He looked like her, the same dark eyes, the same bone structure. For the first time in her life, Sarah saw her features reflected in another human being, and the emotion of it nearly buckled her knees. Inside, she met her other siblings. Vanessa, perfectly coiffed and wielding a smile that could grace magazine covers, and Christopher, younger and quieter, who seemed genuinely excited by her arrival. Their father, Richard Whitmore, was away on business but sent his regards. The absence felt convenient, though Sarah pushed the thought aside. The next 2 weeks were a fairy tale she'd never dared to imagine. Designer clothes appeared in the guest suite they'd prepared for her, a room larger than her entire apartment. They took her shopping on Fifth Avenue, where Vanessa bought her outfits that cost more than Sarah's monthly salary. There were dinners at exclusive restaurants where Sarah couldn't pronounce half the menu items, and evenings spent in the estate's private theater, watching films that hadn't even premiered publicly yet. Marcus explained that their mother had left a trust for Sarah, millions of dollars that had been waiting for her to be found. "You'll never have to worry about money again," he'd said, squeezing her shoulder. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, the weight she'd carried for so long. The constant calculation of expenses and the anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck began to lift. She felt like Cinderella after midnight struck, except instead of turning back into a servant, she was transforming into a princess. The first discordant note was subtle enough that Sarah almost dismissed it. During a family dinner, she'd mentioned wanting to establish a charity to help other adoptees navigate the search for biological family. Vanessa's smile had frozen for just a fraction of a second before brightening again. "How wonderfully public-spirited," she'd said, her tone not quite matching her words. Then there were the doctors. So many doctors. Marcus explained that the family had a comprehensive health screening tradition, just routine physicals to ensure everyone was in optimal health. But Sarah found herself shuttled between specialists with unusual frequency: blood work, genetic panels, tissue compatibility tests. When she questioned the extent of the testing, the doctors waved away her concerns with practiced reassurance. Sarah began to notice the family's pattern of steering conversations away from certain topics, particularly anything regarding their mother Victoria's past or the circumstances of Sarah's adoption. Whenever she pressed for details, doors closed metaphorically and sometimes literally. Christopher once started to answer a question about their mother's health history, but was quickly cut off by Vanessa's sharp interjection about dinner plans. The breaking point came 3 weeks into her stay. Sarah had left her phone in the study and returned to retrieve it, approaching quietly on the plush-carpeted hallway. Through the partially open door, she heard voices. Marcus and Vanessa, their tones stripped of the warmth they'd shown her. "The compatibility is perfect," Marcus was saying. "Dr. Chen confirmed it yesterday. She's a complete match." "And she suspects nothing?" Vanessa's voice was cold, clinical. "Nothing. She's too busy playing princess. Father was right. Find the bastard child, make her feel loved, and harvest what we need before she realizes she's not actually getting a cent of mother's trust." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle the gasp threatening to escape. She backed away from the door on trembling legs, her mind racing to process what she'd just heard. Compatibility, match, harvest. The excessive medical testing suddenly took on a sinister meaning. Sarah rushed back to her guest suite, her heart hammering as pieces clicked into horrible place. She opened her laptop and began searching frantically. Organ donation, family coercion, biological family kidney scam, inheritance fraud. The stories that populated her screen made her stomach turn. Within an hour, she'd uncovered articles about Richard Whitmore's declining health, kidney failure mentioned in a year-old business journal. She found the trust documents Marcus had shown her and noticed for the first time the convenient clause stating the funds would transfer only after she'd completed comprehensive family health integration procedures. The legal language was deliberately opaque, but Sarah now understood its true meaning. They hadn't found her because they loved her or because she belonged with them. They'd found her because Richard Whitmore needed a kidney, and biological relatives made the best donors. The fairy tale had been a calculated deception designed to make her compliant, grateful, and willing to give up a part of herself, literally, for people who saw her not as family, but as spare parts. Sarah didn't confront them immediately. Instead, she did what years of struggling had taught her. She made a plan. Using the very resources they'd given her access to, she contacted an independent attorney, arranged for copies of all medical records, and documented everything she could find about the Whitmore family's true intentions. The truth was even darker than she'd initially feared. Richard Whitmore had 3 biological children, but due to lifestyle factors and genetic issues, none were suitable kidney donors. Sarah, born from an affair Victoria had desperately hidden, was the perfect biological match they'd spent considerable money tracking down. The entire reunion had been orchestrated by Marcus, who stood to inherit control of the family empire if his father survived long enough to transition power, a timeline that required the transplant to happen within months. The trust Marcus had shown her was real, but access was contingent upon her voluntary organ donation. If she refused, the family had inserted clauses that would designate her psychologically unfit to manage such wealth, and the money would revert to the estate. They designed a perfect trap. Give up a kidney to buy your way into unimaginable wealth, or refuse and walk away with nothing, returning to your previous life of struggle. When Sarah finally confronted them at dinner 3 days later, the mask dropped completely. Richard Whitmore, now present, didn't even pretend remorse. "You've lived 28 years in mediocrity," he said coldly. "We're offering you a fortune. 1 kidney. You have 2. It's a fair exchange." But Sarah had learned something crucial during those weeks of deception. Money couldn't buy what truly mattered: integrity, authentic connection, self-worth. She'd survived on $47 in her bank account. She grieved the loss of her adoptive parents, who loved her unconditionally, asking nothing in return. She didn't need the Whitmores' poisoned fortune. "I am keeping both my kidneys," Sarah said quietly, standing from the table. "And you can keep your blood money." She left the estate that evening with only the clothes she'd arrived in, rejecting every gift, every promise, every manipulation. She filed a police report documenting the coercion, and though the Whitmores' lawyers were formidable, the publicity damaged their carefully cultivated reputation irreparably. Sarah returned to her studio apartment, to her modest job, to her ordinary life. But she was fundamentally changed. She'd glimpsed wealth's seductive power and rejected it when it came at the cost of her humanity. She'd learned that family wasn't defined by blood or money, but by genuine love and respect. And she'd discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in the strength to choose dignity over desperation. The experience left her with something more valuable than any inheritance: the unshakable knowledge that she was worth more than the sum of her organs, her compliance, or her desperation. She was worth everything, exactly as she was, and no amount of money could make her forget that truth again.